Okay, sorry, that was a brief interruption. So let's continue to talk about this. We got through talking about just kind of if this were GDP, this is how you would calculate it: price times quantity, and then add it all up. You should come up with a sum that looks a lot like that. Down here, you have. We're going to count. Remember, we can only count final goods and services. What does it mean to be a final good or service? That means that that's the final transaction that takes place with that specific product. Let's talk a little bit about what that means. So you've got a 1 pound of tomatoes that is sold from a grower, a tomato farmer, to a processor, right? That bottle of ketchup is then sold from the processor to Kroger. So that tomato has been manufactured, it's made into ketchup, and it is sold to Kroger. The Kroger sells ketchup to the consumer. Well, the total number of dollars spent on that one product was 5, but we only count 3. Well, why is that? Why do we only count 3 when we're talking about GDP? The answer is that the 50 cents and the $1.50 were not the final product. The final product is when the product was finally sold for $3. Okay? Because if you end up counting all of this and totaling, okay, well, buying and selling, $5 worth of buying and selling, then what you end up doing is you double count. The same product was added up 3 times. It's got to be the final product is the one that ultimately matters when calculating GDP. Okay? Let's move on. Okay. GDP, what is produced within a nation in a given year? If it was produced in the U.S., it is counted towards GDP in America. Okay, so it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it was a foreign country producing, it doesn't matter if it was a foreign company that resides in the United States that produces the product. If it's produced in the U.S., it's U.S. GDP. So, for example, you're selling a Honda Accord, right? And a dealership sells this Honda Accord in Missouri to a Missouri resident, then that counts towards U.S. GDP. It doesn't count towards Japanese GDP because it was sold in the United States, even though it may have even been produced somewhere else. So, if it was produced in the United States, it is counted towards GDP of America. If it is produced in South Africa, it is counted towards GDP of South Africa, even if it is produced by a foreign-owned company. Okay, so one correction. It has to be, so if it's produced in the country, it has to be. So I mentioned earlier, Missouri, even if it was produced in Japan, if it's produced in Japan, it's Japanese GDP. Okay, so you just got to go with where it was produced, as opposed to necessarily where it was sold. So produced in 2009 and it's sold in 2010, it would end up counting as 2009 GDP. Remember, all final goods and services produced in a given year. Okay, produced in a given year. So that would be 2009 GDP. You can also calculate through aggregate spending. What is this going to look like? Well, C is consumer spending, and there's a formula associated with it I'll show you in a second. So C is consumer spending, household spending on goods and services is what we're talking about there. This is going to be the biggest facet of GDP. This is households purchasing from firms. This happens more than anything else. C equals consumer spending. I equals investment spending. on physical capital or any changes to inventories. G is government spending, total purchases by the government, not by consumers. Okay, and then exports and imports, or net exports. That would be exports minus imports. You could also say X minus I, okay, which would imply exports minus imports. This number could be a negative number, okay? And if it's a negative number, then what do you know has happened? Well, they probably imported more than they've exported. There's a trade deficit there, okay? If it's a positive number down here, then they have exported more than they've imported, okay? So that's how the formula would look. Again, C, consumer spending, I, investment spending, G, government spending, and then net exports, okay? Calculating GDP, you can also do this through income earned, and this isn't as typical. I'm mostly going to ask you guys how to do this with the formula. The formula is the most common way, the one we just went over about calculating GDP. Total income earned in the economy, total income earned in the economy, each sale in the economy must accrue someone income, okay? So if Hollister sells a shirt, the money that they end up taking in is going to go towards someone, somewhere down the line's income, okay? Either wages, profit, interest, or rent. And remember, what goes in must go out. It's a circular flow we're talking about here. Sum the total factor income earned by a household from firm in the economy, wages plus rents plus interest plus profits. And then this is the best place to look at this is probably page 110. You can look at that as well. But what's included in GDP? All domestically produced final goods and services, including capital goods, new construction of structures, and changes to inventories. What's not included in GDP, and we've gone over some of it, intermediate goods and services. So the tomato that's ultimately going to be made ketchup, even if it's sold from that tomato farmer to the ketchup producer, you can't count it because that's not the final product. Another one is going to be inputs, okay? Meaning anything, and this is very similar to what we just talked about. If it's created in one place, like maybe like the engine to a car, right? If it's created in one place, sold, and later placed in the car, sold again, then it has to go in as the total, as the car by itself. Then used goods, that would be, so since we're on kind of going with cars, any used car cannot be calculated as GDP, obviously because it was already sold previously, and so counting that would be, again, double counting. Financial assets like stocks and bonds. Why can't you use stocks and bonds? Well, for the very reason that the money that people are putting into stocks and bonds are giving them, or into stocks and bonds, that money is later being spent either by the government if it's a bond, or by a company or a firm to do what they need to do, okay? And you're getting paid back interest on that, okay? So that can't be included either, because when they do what they need to do with that money, that's counted towards GDP, so counting it would be double counting. And then the last one would be foreign produced goods and services. Anything produced in another country, regardless of whether it's sold in the United States or sold obviously sold in that country. If it's produced in China, sold in the United States, it counts towards Chinese GDP. If it's produced in China, sold in China, it counts towards Chinese GDP. And that is it for Module 10. Okay? Study up, read up on the concepts that you're not as familiar with, but that is the end of our first flipped classroom session.